The war reshaped appetites long before it reshaped borders. On battlefields scattered across Europe, the measure of strength was not only found in guns, tanks, or the thunder of artillery, but in what soldiers carried inside their packs and stomachs. Food became as strategic as ammunition. The side that could keep its armies full of energy, protein, and morale gained an invisible advantage, one that could decide the outcome of battles before a single shot was fired. At the beginning of the conflict, German soldiers believed their military stood above all others in discipline, training, and tradition. They valued hearty meals, fresh bread, cured meats, and the comforting flavors of home. Their rations reflected what they thought a soldier needed to stay strong. Solid, real food from the fatherland. When they heard that American troops marched with canned meat, especially canned pork that could sit for years without spoiling, they laughed. It sounded like something a desperate nation might rely on, not a modern army. The Germans mocked it as factory food for people who did not know what genuine cuisine meant. But what they did not see was what lay behind that canned meat. An industrial giant that had turned factories into weapons. Spam had been created long before the war. In 1937, the Hormel Company in the United States introduced it as an affordable, long-lasting source of pork and ham. It did not require refrigeration, could be shipped anywhere in the world, could survive heat, cold, and rough handling. At first, it became popular in American homes. Then the world changed and Spam changed with it. When the United States entered the war, Spam was pulled into uniform. Production surged. Factories ran day and night. Workers pushed millions of cans into crates, each one a tiny piece of energy that could travel across oceans. American supply ships carried it to Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Soldiers learned to cook it in countless ways. Fried, boiled, diced, eaten straight from the can when time was short. It became a familiar companion, sitting in packs and mess kits, ready for any moment a soldier needed calories to keep moving, fighting, and surviving. German soldiers, bored or proud, joked about it early in the war. They liked to imagine American troops opening dull cans of processed mystery meat while they cut into thick slices of sausage or spread butter on dark bread. But as the war stretched on and the German supply chain began to strain, the jokes turned hollow. What had once been reliable suddenly became uncertain. Fields that once fed millions fell under enemy control. Transport routes clogged. Factories were bombed. Farmers were drafted into the army, leaving fewer workers in the countryside. By the winter of 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union believing victory would come quickly. They expected to seize food, fuel, and shelter along the way. Instead, they found mud, cold, resistance, and hunger. Soldiers marched with stomachs growling, living off whatever could be scavenged or rationed out in diminishing portions. Bread shrank. Meat became scarce. Substitutes replaced staples. Coffee became a bitter drink made from roasted barley. Butter turned into margarine made from anything that could be pressed into a block. Meanwhile, America fed not only its own soldiers but also its allies. Convoys crossed the Atlantic, carrying mountains of canned food. British civilians struggling through rationing tasted Spam too. In the Pacific, Marines in jungles cooked it over makeshift fires, joking that it tasted better than anything the enemy could catch or grow. Wherever an American soldier dug a foxhole, a can of Spam was probably not far from his hand. German soldiers eventually encountered it firsthand. At first in captured supply depots, then in abandoned American camps, and finally through surrender and capture. The moment they tasted it, something unexpected happened. Many were surprised by how good it was. It was salty, rich in fat and protein, and far more satisfying than the thin slices of ersatz meat they often received at that point in the war. The laughter faded. Curiosity took its place. Some even traded valuables or extra gear to get more of it. The German high command noticed too. Reports circulated describing American rations as superior in both quantity and quality. Letters home mentioned not only battles but meals. Some officers wondered how a nation could maintain such abundance so far from home, across oceans and continents. The answer was industry. The United States mastered the art of mass production. Food was engineered, planned, shipped and delivered with military precision. A soldier might lose a rifle, but he would rarely lose a meal. This difference influenced morale. A hungry soldier thinks of food more than orders. He marches slower. He hesitates longer. His strength fades. His hope weakens. But a soldier who eats well can fight longer. He can endure the misery of war with a little more will to push forward. Spam became part of that invisible shield of resilience. It gave Americans the calories they needed to keep charging when the enemy expected them to fall back. As battles dragged on, Germany's mockery gave way to silent respect. They saw that what they once dismissed as low-quality canned pork had turned out to be an emblem of a nation with a supply chain that simply did not break. On the Western Front, German prisoners often told their guards that they preferred American food over their own wartime meals. Some even said they would remember Spam more vividly than some of the battles they fought in. The power of Spam was not just in its flavor or nutrition. It symbolized something larger, the ability to feed millions under the harshest conditions. While German soldiers shivered and trudged through mud and snow searching for nourishment, American troops roasted Spam over small fires, laughing and eating together, confident that tomorrow and every tomorrow after would bring more. This contrast became sharper in the final years of the war. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers starved in the brutal Russian winter. In Italy, mountain battles stretched supply routes until they snapped. In France and Belgium, retreating troops scavenged farms, searching for something to fill their bellies. They still fought fiercely, but hunger was the silent enemy always attacking from within. American soldiers faced danger too. Bullets did not care how well they ate, but their bodies were fueled. They marched with more energy. They recovered faster. Their gear weighed lighter when their stomachs were full. Each can of Spam added another spark of energy to keep moving forward. Production numbers tell a story on their own. Over 100 million cans of Spam were sent to the front lines. The number grew so large that even the Hormel company lost count. It became a joke among American troops that the war might be won not by tanks or bombers, but by Spam. Humor aside, there was truth in the thought. Food sustained the fighting spirit that weapons alone could not create. Even leaders acknowledged its value. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill once claimed that Spam had been vital in making victory possible. Soviet soldiers received it through Lend-Lease shipments and praised it as a gift that kept hunger from consuming them in frozen trenches. It became an international food of war, a strange common thread connecting armies separated by borders, cultures, and ideologies. When German soldiers finally surrendered in large numbers, they were often fed American food while waiting to be processed. Many remembered the first satisfying meal they had eaten in months. They asked for seconds. They asked what it was called. They learned the name Spam and did not forget it. Later in life, some told their children and grandchildren that this simple canned meat had given them their first sense that the war was truly over. It was a taste of relief even if it came from the enemy. Looking back today, it might seem odd that a food item could play such a role in history. But wars are won by logistics. Armies that march on empty stomachs cannot march far. Armies that rely on shrinking supplies eventually stall. Industrial power fed American troops through every turn of the war. The ability to convert factories into engines of nutrition became one of the most crucial advantages the Allies possessed. Spam became more than a product. It became a symbol that the United States had mastered the art of supplying war. It proved that food could be a weapon of endurance. And German soldiers who once laughed had to accept a humbling truth. The army that ate well had a stronger chance of surviving to see victory. The story of Spam in World War II begins where pride and hunger collide. It is a journey that reveals how food shaped the lives of millions of soldiers in foxholes, trenches, and tanks. It is one of the most unusual twists in military history, where the taste of canned pork could change a soldier's mood, morale, and belief in survival. This is how a simple can erased laughter and replaced it with respect. This story does not just belong to American history or German history. It belongs to every battlefield where hunger fought against hope. It reminds the world that even in the harshest chapters of war, something as ordinary as a meal could provide extraordinary strength. And when all the guns went silent and soldiers returned home, Many carried the memory of Spam with them, a small but powerful reminder of how they endured. The war would continue to test both sides. But from this moment on, German soldiers no longer laughed at the American rations. They understood what those cans represented. They realized that behind every bite was the force of a vast industrial nation pouring its strength into the fight. Food had become a quiet conqueror, and Spam was its most unlikely hero. The deeper the war pressed into Europe, the clearer the contrast became. Could be tasted. It could be felt in the strength left in a soldier's stride. Even exhausted American troops, battered by long marches or sleepless nights, carried a simple comfort in their pockets. A meal that would be there when they needed it. The same could not be said for their German counterparts. German rationing had begun even before the invasion of Poland. The leadership knew that the war effort demanded sacrifice, and they planned their food supply under the assumption that conquered territories would feed the Reich. It was a dangerous gamble. Victory feeding the army rather than the army earning its victory. For a time, it seemed to work. Troops ate well during early campaigns. They pressed forward with speed and confidence, convinced the world would fall quickly. But as the war expanded, their strategy revealed its cracks. Every mile deeper into enemy lands stretched the supply chain thinner. Every setback meant more mouths and fewer supplies. Germany found itself fighting not just armies, but distance itself, losing strength not through bullets but through hunger and exhaustion. American troops, meanwhile, were backed by a machine of production unmatched in history. Factories that once produced household goods now poured out crates of army supplies. Railways, highways, and shipping lanes delivered them with relentless efficiency. Whether fighting through jungles, crossing deserts, or freezing in the Ardennes, the soldiers could depend on their next meal. Spam was more than a food. It was a morale booster. Something quick. Something guaranteed. Something that reminded them there was still normality somewhere in the world. They invented clever ways to prepare it. Mixed with potatoes to make hash. Seared crispy in a pan and slapped between bread to make a sandwich. Even eaten cold from the can, it kept the body going and the spirits from dipping too low. Letters sent back home often included jokes about Spam. Soldiers teased that they would never want to see another can once the war ended. Yet they continued to reach for it day after day. They relied on it. Because when everything else in war becomes unpredictable, a reliable meal is a quiet victory. German troops noticed the difference on battlefields long before they tasted any American rations. They saw their enemy pushing hard, through snowstorms and fatigue, without slowing. They wondered how the Americans kept going, especially in places where German soldiers felt ready to collapse. Rumors spread that the Americans must have endless supplies. Some even believed their morale was strengthened by luxuries like chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes that German troops could only dream of encountering regularly as the war stretched on. By 1943, the realities of scarcity haunted the German ranks. Replacement units arrived thinner than veterans remembered. Bread was stretched further with fillers. The once revered sausage became a modest sliver. Soldiers began to count calories instead of victories. They shared stories at night of home-cooked meals, of flavors forgotten. Hunger gnawed not only at their stomachs but at their resolve. The Americans, in contrast, often shared food among units. If someone needed more, a nearby quartermaster could usually supply it. Trucks rumbled daily with fresh deliveries. Supply depots brimmed with crates that could be opened and used without delay. The promise of a steady meal was woven into the very structure of the U.S. Army. As American troops advanced across Western Europe after D-Day, more German units encountered their supplies firsthand. Soldiers who expected to find spoils of war were stunned to discover how well their enemies ate. Not just Spam, but stews, beans, cheese, fruit, and biscuits. Cigarette packs stacked neatly beside the food. Coffee tins waiting to be brewed. Every can, every carton, every ration pack told a story of abundance that German soldiers could barely imagine anymore. In the Pacific, Spam earned an additional reputation. It kept soldiers alive in remote places where no fresh meat could survive. It could endure heat, humidity, insects, and salt air. Marines joked that Spam was the only thing in their packs more durable than their boots. It became a symbol of survival against climates that tried to swallow them whole. German forces heard stories of American troops living like kings compared to the ration shortages tearing through Europe. At first, the stories sounded exaggerated, propaganda meant to weaken morale. But direct experience silenced doubts. When German troops surrendered or retreated, they sometimes approached American lines not in fear, but in the quiet hope of securing a meal that would fill the hollowness inside them. Spam became an object of fascination. It looked simple, a rectangle of pink meat encased in a tin. But the flavor shocked men who were used to thin cuts, stale bread, and ersatz replacements. Fat tasted like luxury. Salt tasted like indulgence. For some Germans, the first bite felt like waking from a long winter sleep. Many German soldiers later admitted they had underestimated the value of reliable food. They were trained to believe superior discipline and tactical brilliance could conquer any challenge. But discipline could not fill an empty stomach. Bravery could not replace muscle lost to starvation. Even the strongest soldier falters when hunger becomes a daily companion. As the war dragged into its later years, some German commanders tried to replicate the concept of stable, preserved meat rations. Factories were pressured to produce canned meals designed to travel easily. But shortages of materials and constant bombings crippled those efforts. They did not have the pork. They did not have the processing. They did not have the fuel to keep up. The idea could not become reality. American industrial success was not accidental. It relied on a nation untouched by the devastation destroying Europe. Farms continued to harvest. Mills continued to grind. Livestock continued to be raised and processed. The food kept coming, and soldiers could feel that support with every bite. Even after the war, when former German soldiers looked back on their experiences, the memory of Spam lingered. Some joked that the canned meat was the true conqueror of Europe. Others spoke of how that small can provided the first real warmth they had felt in months during captivity. It reminded them that life existed beyond hunger, beyond fear. It reminded them that the world still contained simple pleasures. Historians studying logistics often point to food as a weapon with its own battlefield. Not as dramatic as a tank or a bomber, but equally decisive. A well-fed soldier fights with certainty and strength. A starving soldier fights with desperation, then exhaustion, then nothing left at all. The German army learned this harsh lesson as supplies dwindled and defeat approached. The transformation of American rations from a joke to a sign of power happened slowly, then all at once. Every spoonful of Spam was a reminder that the Americans did not enter the war unprepared or weakened. They entered it backed by one of the most efficient support systems ever built. They fed their fighters as if food was ammunition, because in many ways it was. When German troops finally surrendered en masse at the end of the conflict, many experienced a strange sense of relief, not just from surviving the battlefield, but from knowing the hunger would stop. The sight of American supply crates brought comfort more powerful than propaganda. Their bellies would be full again. They would sleep without the ache of emptiness waking them in the night. By then, Spam had become famous far beyond military circles. Civilians in Europe, especially those suffering severe rationing, came to rely on it as a rare treat. Relief shipments included it. Refugees tasted it with gratitude. Desperate families viewed one can as a treasure. It spread beyond camps and into kitchens, becoming a small symbol of hope that life would improve. After the war ended, Spam continued to leave its mark on culture. In places like Britain, South Korea, and Hawaii, it became part of local cuisine. It earned nicknames, became the punchline of jokes, and even inspired comedy sketches. But beneath all the humor remained a truth. Spam helped win a war. The German soldiers who once mocked it understood what few civilians could appreciate. They knew hunger intimately, painfully. They knew that a stomach full of calories could be as decisive as a magazine full of bullets. They knew that the difference between collapse and endurance might come sealed inside a simple can. It reminded them that wars are not fought only on battlefields. They are fought in factories, on farms, across highways, in shipping lanes. Victory belongs to the side that can sustain its will long after the other weakens. Spam became one of the great equalizers of the conflict, capable of reaching places fresh food could not. It arrived when needed, stayed good until used, and asked little from the soldiers who depended on it. In return, it offered energy, warmth, and a flavor that spoke of home. The Germans who once laughed now respected the strange pink brick of meat. Tasting it taught them what American power truly meant. It was not about extravagance. It was about consistency. It was about showing up fully prepared to support every soldier every day. This realization shaped their view of the war's outcome. It helped them understand how an army from across the ocean could sustain relentless campaigns thousands of miles from home. It helped them see that the battle for supply lines was just as important as the battle for ground. And so the war continued, with each side fighting not just with weapons, but with willpower fueled by whatever food fell into their hands. Every soldier who opened a can of Spam tasted more than pork. They tasted endurance. They tasted a reminder that they were part of a machine designed to keep them alive. They tasted the bond between home and the front line. As more German soldiers tasted it during their capture or retreat, their old jokes faded away. They replaced laughter with curiosity, then curiosity with appreciation, and finally appreciation with an understanding they had once refused to believe. This canned meat they mocked was one of the quiet reasons they lost. As the war entered its later stages, the German army's struggle for food reached a breaking point. What began as minor cutbacks turned into a slow erosion of strength. Soldiers learned to make do with less and less. Meals that once brought comfort became reminders of scarcity. Hunger was an enemy that did not rest, that did not negotiate, that did not care about courage or loyalty. It gnawed at every man equally. Commanders attempted to maintain discipline and morale, but soldiers could not help noticing how the quality of their rations slipped away. Fresh bread became rare. Heavy, filling stews turned thin and watery. Potatoes appeared less frequently, then disappeared almost entirely in some regions. Ersatz products took over. Ersatz butter. Ersatz coffee. Ersatz everything. The word itself became a symbol of disappointment. A substitution for something that used to exist but was no longer within reach. A reminder that Germany's strength was fading. In this environment, the idea of a can of real pork became something almost mythical. Meanwhile, in the American camps, soldiers continued to see familiar shapes in their mess kits. Spam was always there, sometimes too often for their liking, but it was there. Its presence was constant, reliable, reassuring. It did not need to be hunted down or chased after or scavenged in the ruins of battle. It waited patiently to be opened. Whatever else happened in the war, there would be Spam. When units moved into areas recently vacated by American troops, German soldiers began to search abandoned camps for supplies. They found cans stacked neatly in crates, ready to be consumed. They could not understand how the Americans could afford to leave so much behind when German soldiers counted every crumb. They pried open the tins with curious fingers, expecting something bland, processed, barely edible. Instead, they found meat that reminded them of better days, of warmth, of meals shared at family tables back home. The first bite erased all doubt. Whatever jokes they had made before, they stopped making them now. For many German soldiers, the discovery of Spam was not only a surprise but a source of envy. They wondered what it must be like to fight in an army with such resources. An army that did not fear hunger. An army that marched with a full stomach, no matter how fierce the battle had been. An army whose soldiers did not have to ration their strength because their food never ran out. Letters written home during captivity revealed these thoughts clearly. Former soldiers described how amazed they were by American rations. Some even requested American canned meat in care packages after the war ended. They told their families it tasted better than anything they had received in the final years of the conflict. The memory lingered long after the fighting stopped. Within Germany, rumors spread faster than supplies. Soldiers spoke of American abundance as if it were a distant fantasy. They said the Americans lived like civilians even in the middle of the war. Stories circulated of American mess halls filled with meat, vegetables, fruit, milk, and chocolate. German soldiers could barely believe it, yet every surrendered unit confirmed that the stories were true. When captured soldiers were sent to prisoner-of-war camps, they quickly discovered that their new diet often surpassed what they had eaten as active combat troops. They were fed well not as a gesture of luxury, but simply because the United States had the capacity to do so. A captured soldier who felt his strength returning could not ignore the message this nourishment delivered. The enemy could feed him better than his own country could. In those camps, Spam became a familiar sight. A hot meal carrying the scent of pork and spices felt like a gift. Prisoners who had nearly forgotten the taste of real meat were reminded that hunger did not have to rule their lives. They felt the fog of starvation lift. They remembered what it felt like to have energy again. In those moments, war seemed farther away. The desperation faded, replaced by something close to gratitude. German officers noted this with conflicted emotions. They were proud men who had built careers on the belief that their army was unmatched. But the evidence of American logistical superiority could no longer be denied. They saw how the steady stream of supplies kept American troops fighting with confidence. They understood that a soldier who does not worry about hunger fights with a clear mind. Some officers wrote in their journals about this shocking comparison. They expressed disbelief that a simple canned product could represent such a vast difference in power. They realized that the American war effort was not merely about bravery or strategy, but about resources, organization, and the ability to sustain pressure without collapse. Spam was proof that the Americans could shape the battlefield even from thousands of miles away. On the front lines, German soldiers often joked darkly that their rations were trying to defeat them before the enemy even arrived. They recognized the strange irony that their hunger might accomplish what Allied weapons could not. When they tasted Spam, they tasted the strength of an opponent who did not seem to understand the meaning of scarcity. The psychological effect was profound. Soldiers compared their struggles not just against enemy forces, but against the vast machine of American industry. They saw that they were fighting a nation capable of delivering comfort to every soldier, every day. Germany could no longer do the same. It becomes hard to fight with conviction when the enemy appears limitless. American soldiers rarely thought of food as a weapon. Most complained about monotonous meals and the repetitive presence of Spam. But the effects of those meals were visible every time they marched forward with renewed vigor. Their annoyance with Spam was almost humorous compared to the deep gratitude it inspired in those who tasted it after prolonged hunger. For German soldiers, war was increasingly defined by what they lacked. For Americans, it was defined by what they could count on. Historians often emphasize the importance of strategy, leadership, and firepower. But the stamina to execute those strategies came from calories. The strength to advance came from protein. The courage to face another day of combat often began with a warm meal. A can of Spam represented all of this. As the war turned decisively against Germany, hunger became more than a hardship. It became a weapon used against them by the relentless advance of the Allies. Rail lines were cut. Farmland slipped away behind enemy lines. Factories ran out of raw materials. Soldiers began to trade pieces of their equipment for food, desperate to keep their bodies functioning. The contrast between armies became undeniable. German soldiers saw Americans not as lucky, but as powered by a system designed to support victory. They saw that the Americans had planned for everything, even the simple necessity of eating. Spam was more than sustenance. It was a symbol that the Americans would not break. They could feed their troops anywhere, under any conditions, for any length of time. It represented a promise to every soldier. You will not starve. You will be strong enough to fight tomorrow. You will not be abandoned. This promise was something the Germans could no longer make to their own. The power of that message shaped the outcome of battles. It kept American soldiers pushing forward in moments when exhaustion should have stopped them. Kept morale intact through the worst conditions. It gave commanders confidence that their troops would not falter due to lack of food. For the Germans, every encounter with Spam reinforced the painful truth that they were outmatched not only in firepower, but in the war of supply. Their pride in discipline and strength could not overcome the weakness created by hunger. It is a strange thought that one of the most iconic images of American wartime strength fit inside the palm of a soldier's hand. Yet there it was. A can of Spam, serving quietly in the shadows of war, delivering energy and hope one meal at a time. The German soldiers who once mocked it understood that their laughter had been misplaced. They learned that food can win battles long before soldiers step onto the field. They saw that the army with the best meals often has the best chance of victory. This lesson became one of the defining truths of the war. Not all victories are loud. Some come wrapped in tin, quietly altering the fate of nations. The war pressed on, and with every bite of Spam, the American soldier found strength to take one step more. And with every empty stomach in the German ranks, defeat came one step closer. Continuing the story right where it left off, keeping the same pacing, third-person documentary tone, smooth for AI narration, and with no titles so you can copy directly into your script generator. The canned meat glistened slightly in the firelight, its pink surface reflecting the glow like polished marble. A few German soldiers watched, whispering among themselves, suspicious but increasingly intrigued. It wasn't just the appearance that caught their interest. It was the smell, that salty, savory aroma that curled through the cold night air like bait on a hook. Their own food never smelled like that anymore. Nothing smelled like that anymore. One soldier dared to speak first, his voice a quiet confession. He admitted he hadn't tasted real pork in months, not counting the small scraps hidden beneath layers of watery stew. Those scraps had become distant memories, like warmth, like home. But here, in that simple dented can, was something entirely different, something almost luxurious. It enraged them a little if they were honest. How could the enemy have something so rich while they starved? Yet hunger has a way of overpowering pride. One soldier reached out. His fingers trembled slightly, whether from cold or hesitation even he didn't know. He took a piece between his fingertips, examined it as though it might leap from his hand, then slowly placed it into his mouth. The change was immediate. His eyes widened. His chewing slowed to a reverent pace. For a moment, he simply stared into nothing, as if transported somewhere warm and safe. He took a quick breath, almost embarrassed by the joy sparking across his tongue. The others noticed. They leaned in. "What does it taste like?" someone finally asked. He swallowed, then answered in a small voice that carried the weight of revelation. "Like meat. Real meat." That was all it took. Hands reached out without hesitation, tearing small fragments free, dividing them with surprising fairness. Men who had taken rifles from one another in arguments shared this meal like brothers. It was instinctive, primeval. The act of sharing food meant trust, and trust was rare these days. The American soldiers watched silently, allowing the moment to unfold. There was no mockery, no gloating, just an odd camaraderie formed between enemies, all because of a simple meal. After a few minutes, one German officer finally spoke. He forced a laugh, a thin veil over discomfort. "So this is what the Americans eat every day?" The Americans did not answer right away. They didn't need to. The Germans already knew. The officer's mocking tone faded into something more serious. His gaze drifted off into the darkness, where artillery rumblings echoed like distant thunder. He understood. If the Americans could feed their soldiers so well everywhere all the time, then their supply chain was not just functioning. It was thriving. Their factories were thriving. Their farms were thriving. Their entire war effort was thriving. And that meant something terrifying. This war was no longer a contest of strategy or bravery alone. It was a contest of stomachs, of fuel, of factories that never rested, of ships that never stopped crossing oceans, of an enemy whose resources seemed endless. The Germans had tasted more than pork. They had tasted the truth. Spam wasn't just food. It was a symbol, a message sealed in tin. They had mocked it, laughed at it, but now that laughter tasted bitter. Because inside that can was something Germany could no longer produce: abundance. The moment ended as quickly as it began. Orders were shouted, weapons collected. The temporary peace evaporated like steam off hot soup. But the taste lingered. As the Germans marched back into the forest, one of them carried the empty Spam can. He stared at it as though it were a strange artifact from another civilization. something born of a world where hunger was a myth. He wondered, quietly, what other luxuries his enemy enjoyed without a second thought. Not that it mattered anymore. He shook his head and slid the can into his coat pocket, a silent souvenir of humiliation and awe. He did not know that millions more cans were being produced at that very moment, rolling off conveyor belts under bright American lights. Factories humming, workers laughing, trucks loading shipment after shipment. A river of food flowing toward the front lines, unstoppable and endless. And far behind him, in a different part of the Ardennes, another American soldier opened a fresh can with the same familiar ritual. The metal lid popped. The scent drifted into frozen air. Steam rose from a small cooking flame. He didn't think anything of it. To him, it was just dinner. To the enemy, it was evidence of a war they could no longer afford to fight. The future of the conflict was sealed not just with bullets and bombs but with meals like this. Every bite a reminder of who was running out of strength and who was still gaining it. And deep inside every German soldier who had tasted Spam that night, something unsettling settled into their minds. They had laughed at American rations. But hunger had silenced their laughter. And the war was far from over. They walked deeper into the forest, boots sinking into snow that muffled every step. The world around them seemed carved from ice and silence, except for the low rumbles of distant artillery and the occasional snapping of frozen branches. Every sound felt sharper in the cold, as if the forest itself listened for danger. The Germans kept moving, but their minds stayed behind with the Americans, back at that flickering fire where real food had waited like a secret. The shortest among them, a young private no older than 19, rubbed his stomach absent-mindedly. He had forgotten the sensation of feeling full, even for a moment. Now the emptiness returned, more noticeable than before. That tiny taste of Spam had awakened something his body had tried to forget. Hunger wasn't just a dull ache anymore. It was a roaring animal. A sergeant, older and worn thin by the war, noticed the faraway look in his eyes. He had seen that expression many times since the fighting began. It was the look a man wore when hope and hunger battled inside him. "Don't think too much about it," the sergeant muttered, though his own voice betrayed jealousy. The young soldier nodded, but the memory clung stubbornly. The warmth of the food, the flavor, the realization that his enemies ate like kings compared to them. For months he had been told that Germany would prevail. That sacrifice would be rewarded. That victory demanded hardship. Now he wondered if those promises had only been meant to keep starving men marching forward. The officer leading them halted the column. He turned, scanning their faces. He was a strict man, always composed, his uniform despite the weather still sharp and precise. Yet tonight his eyes were restless. Something about that encounter had shaken even him. He looked down at the empty Spam can bulging in his pocket. It had weight, not physical but symbolic. The clink of metal against his coat seemed louder than it should. He took a slow breath, forcing the air past the frustration tightening his chest. "We say nothing of this to command," he ordered. "Is that understood?" There were quick nods, unquestioned obedience. But beneath the surface, doubt simmered like a pot close to boiling. They resumed marching. Every step into the darkness felt like another reminder of how far they lagged behind. They were told the Americans were weak, inexperienced, soft. Yet it was the ones called soft who had full bellies and warm fires. It was the hardened veterans who walked hungry, wearing boots worn to the point of failure. The Germans reached a ruined farmhouse, their temporary shelter. They huddled inside, grateful at least to escape the wind. One man tore open what remained of their rations. Dark, stale bread. A tin of ersatz meat that smelled faintly sour even before the lid was fully peeled back. A few shrugged and ate anyway, because hunger leaves little room for pride. But every bite tasted worse than the last, tainted by memory. Spam had changed their expectations. Across many parts of Europe, similar encounters played out. German troops finding American supply dumps after battles. Opening crates, discovering chocolate bars, instant coffee, canned meat, real sugar, and more calories in a day's ration than some German soldiers saw all week. The irony was brutal. So much of German propaganda had mocked American consumerism, their wastefulness, their obsession with convenience. Yet convenience in war meant survival. While Germany rationed every crumb, the United States mass-produced abundance like a weapon. Factories ran day and night, metal stamping and conveyors clanging like the heartbeat of a powerful giant. Cans rolled off the lines by the millions, each one destined for the front like soldiers in uniform. There was no glamour in a Spam can. It did not carry the thrill of a shiny new rifle or a roaring tank. But it kept men moving, kept armies alive. Wars are not won only by courage. They are won by calories, by meals that arrive on time, by armies that don't go to bed hungry. Back at the farmhouse, the sergeant sat against a cracked stone wall, staring through a shattered window at the frozen hills. The cold gnawed at him. Frost gathered in his beard. His breath plumed like smoke. The Germans reached a ruined farmhouse, their temporary shelter. They huddled inside, grateful at least to escape the wind. One man tore open what remained of their rations. Dark, stale bread. A tin of ersatz meat that smelled faintly sour even before the lid was fully peeled back. A few shrugged and ate anyway, because hunger leaves little room for pride. But every bite tasted worse than the last, tainted by memory. Spam had changed their expectations. Across many parts of Europe, similar encounters played out. German troops finding American supply dumps after battles, opening crates, discovering chocolate bars, instant coffee, canned meat, real sugar, and more calories in a day's ration than some German soldiers saw all week. The irony was brutal. So much of German propaganda had mocked American consumerism, their wastefulness, their obsession with convenience. Yet convenience in war meant survival. While Germany rationed every crumb, the United States mass-produced abundance like a weapon. Factories ran day and night, metal stamping and conveyors clanging like the heartbeat of a powerful giant. Cans rolled off the lines by the millions, each one destined for the front like soldiers in uniform. There was no glamour in a Spam can. It did not carry the thrill of a shiny new rifle or a roaring tank. But it kept men moving, kept armies alive. Wars are not won only by courage. They are won by calories, by meals that arrive on time, by armies that don't go to bed hungry. Back at the farmhouse, the sergeant sat against a cracked stone wall, staring through a shattered window at the frozen hills. The cold gnawed at him. Frost gathered in his beard. His breath plumed like smoke. He thought of home. He imagined a kitchen warm with the scent of roast meat. His mother laughing as she wiped her hands on an apron. Bread fresh from the oven. Butter melting into it. He closed his eyes, letting the memory make him ache. But the memory shifted. Cold metal in his hand. Pink meat that tasted like comfort. A canned miracle born from a distant land untouched by war. His fingers reached toward his pocket, almost without thinking. Then he remembered. That gift had been devoured. Nothing left now but emptiness. He sighed, letting his head rest back with a dull thud. How do you fight someone who never hungers? He whispered to the dark. In another forest clearing not far away, American soldiers laughed around their fire, bellies full, unaware of the silent envy stalking the trees. One of them smacked his lips and joked about wishing he had fresh eggs instead. Another pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket, taking a bite as though it were nothing. The Germans would have given anything for such luxury. One side marched forward powered by abundance. The other trudged on fueled by desperation. It wouldn't take a strategist to see which army had the advantage. The night stretched longer than usual, and as they tried to sleep, the German soldiers realized the war had changed for them long ago, but only now had they tasted why. Tomorrow they would fight again, but tonight they wrestled with a new fear. Not of bullets, nor bombs, but of an enemy fed by a nation that never stopped eating. Morning arrived not as light, but as a colorless haze barely strong enough to reveal shapes through the trees. The cold was crueler at dawn. It slipped beneath clothing, clung to bones, and reminded every man how fragile he had become. The German unit rose slowly, stiff and worn. Their breaths puffed clouds into the bitter air, as if their spirits were trying to escape their bodies. They gathered their gear without words. The silence spoke enough. Exhaustion, hunger, resignation. Yet orders were orders. The war cared little for empty stomachs. The officer who had carried the empty can stepped outside and looked toward the distant horizon. Snowflakes drifted down like falling ash. He touched the metal in his pocket. It was still cold from the night before. He never imagined a canned meal could be a symbol of defeat, but here it was. A reminder that this war was no longer about who fought hardest. It was about who still had the strength to fight at all. He looked back at his men, at their sunken cheeks and hollow eyes. Once they had marched with confidence, believing they were the unstoppable ones. Now every step felt like a borrowed breath. And though none dared say it aloud, they all understood a truth sharper than any blade. The Americans weren't winning because of bravery alone. They were winning because they were fed. Across the trees, U.S. soldiers were already awake as well, heating breakfast over quick-built fires. They talked casually, joked, passed around cans and coffee, as if they were back home camping for leisure instead of fighting a brutal war. Their supplies came with unwavering certainty. Planes delivered. Trucks delivered. Ships delivered. The line never broke. And each can of food was proof of a nation that simply had more to give. When the time came to move out, the German officer gave one last glance at the can in his hand. He turned it over slowly, studying the label as if it might explain the magic within. A product of a world powered by factories and farms so vast that even destruction on a global scale could not slow them. He slipped the can back into his coat and led his men forward. Artillery fire soon cracked across the frozen landscape, echoing like the sky itself was splitting open. The battle swallowed them again, chaos relentless and unforgiving. Men shouted, weapons roared, the earth trembled. And through it all, hunger stalked them like a silent enemy inside their own ribs. Somewhere in the frenzy, the officer stumbled. The empty can clattered into the snow, spinning once before coming to rest. A single streak of sunlight glinted off its surface. He reached for it, but his fingers were shaking too much to grasp it. He stared at the tin for a moment longer, letting the truth settle like frost on his skin. An empire could be undone not by a stronger army, but by a stronger supply line. He left the can where it lay. Hours later, when the smoke cleared and silence returned, the can remained half buried in snow, untouched and unnoticed by those who passed. But the message it carried had already completed its mission. American abundance was a weapon that never jammed, a weapon soldiers could taste, a weapon that reminded every man fighting against it that he was not only outgunned but outfed. Spam continued to flow across Europe, feeding wave after wave of soldiers who would push forward until the final German strongholds collapsed. Millions of cans, millions of meals, millions of reminders that the United States was fighting with an industrial giant at its back. For the German troops who had once laughed at those silver tins, the joke had turned bitter. Their mockery had been swallowed along with every precious bite. Spam was no hero in a medal ceremony. It did not march or shoot or fly, yet it became a quiet legend of World War II, sustaining men who would carry the weight of victory. In the end, wars are not decided only by the bravery of those who fight, but by the strength of the nation that feeds them. And long after the guns fell silent, the memory remained. They had mocked American canned meat. Then they tasted the truth.